Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I'm doing my reading wrap up for the month of March. So, first on the list is series that I finished in the month of March, and that would be the Between Earth and Sky series by Rebecca Roanhorse. I've talked about this multiple times on the channel. This one actually really surprised me in good ways. I was enjoying the world building and the concept and the characters, but the way that the plot unfolds in the first two books is a little uneven, because in the first book you've got sort of everyone is doing their own thing and it's sort of kind of related, but we're kind of learning about the characters, and that's fine. And there's a cat in the background playing with a toy, so that's why there's crinkly noises. In the second book, it was very much setting things up for the third book, and so you've got sort of slow progression, you've got character developments, but it really wasn't grabbing me in the way that I kind of thought it would, seeing as how the first one ended. And then you get to the third one, and the third book is sort of where everything happened. All of a sudden there's like a primary antagonist, and everyone kind of has very specific goals, and it really felt like sort of the series was careening towards like a final confrontation, and there was a lot of really satisfying things that happened in this one. So overall, I did enjoy the series, but I think it does take a bit of a commitment, not in terms of the books are slow, but it's very obvious that there's sort of the hand of the author arranging things so that when we get to the final book, all the stuff can kind of happen. And so it didn't feel quite as seamless. There's some series that it just feels like everything happens because that's how it has to happen, and so the characters sort of pull you along and things happen, and it really, really blew me away. So overall, I did enjoy the series. I think the world building is fantastic, and the character arcs are really good, but the execution in terms of the overall pacing, I think, was the thing that kind of kept it from being like an outstanding 5-star read, but I would still highly recommend this one. The characters in the series are excellent. So I was really excited to finish the series, and I'm glad it ended on a high note. Next up is series that I started in March, and there's two of them. One, I don't know if it really counts because it's a duology, but we'll count it anyways. And so I read Monk and Robots Book 1, A Psalm for the Wild-Built by Becky Chambers, and I loved this one. This is just a short exploration of human nature, and it's cozy, but it's not silly. It's sort of, this is a book that could very well have been fluffy and saccharine, but it wasn't. It was really engaging. It was compelling. The questions that were explored were deep and meaningful, and the character's inner journey of sort of what he was struggling with was really sort of relatable, and I really, really enjoyed this one. So I'm excited to read the second book in the series. I've got it on hold on Libby, so whenever that one shows up, I am looking forward to reading it. The other series that I started was Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is sort of one of those books where it was a good book, but it didn't like blow me away in big explosive ways. There are other books in the series. I don't know if I'm going to continue with the series. If it comes across on Libby, I probably will, because Adrian Tchaikovsky is a good writer. The world building is really good. There's a whole subplot, well, not really a subplot, but like a parallel plot. There's like two main plots, and there's one plot that follows sort of the development of this race of sentient spiders on this planet, and how their society changes and grows, and how the main character sort of, her ancestors sort of learn and grow and develop. And it was really, really compelling. The world building was really good. It reminded me a lot of Avatar, the movie Avatar, in terms of like the world building, like the planet really felt like a living, breathing world. And the way that everything interacts with everything else was really good. And so like it was a really fantastically crafted book. And then you got the other plot, which follows the humans in a sort of generational ship kind of situation, and we see kind of how their society changes over the centuries, along with the culture on the planet, and sort of how the two cultures interact. And overall, it was really, really good. I feel like the ending was a little too easy. It felt like the ending of like a Star Trek episode, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because I'm a huge Star Trek fan and everything. But sometimes you have like an episode where you have sort of all of the pieces are there, and then at the end everything just neatly fits together and it resolves the situation quite tidily. And I don't know if that really worked for me in a book situation because this is a very epic scope of a book. It follows many, 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 many years, and there's a lot of big stuff happening, big questions. I really liked how we have the human sort of civilization sort of starts to collapse into anarchy, and then the spider civilization sort of becomes more and more outward looking and advanced over the years. And so you kind of get this sort of parallel development. But with that kind of epic sweeping scope, I feel like having the ending be something that could be resolved in like a page or a paragraph felt not silly, but it was a little too easy. I kind of wanted there to be sort of more struggle with these two cultures, and I get that's not what the author was going for. So this is just me being like, you know, if I had written this. So, but the story really, I really wanted the series to be about these two cultures and how they live together. But from what it seems like, each book in the series sort of focuses on a different sort of society, and so each one is kind of a standalone, but they're all sort of connected. The book itself was a really great experience. He has a really wonderful way of writing. It feels fresh and exciting, but it also feels familiar. If you grew up with like Babylon 5 or Star Trek or something like that, it's got that kind of, you know, the relatable cast of sort of quirky characters and the things that they struggle with over time and the way they solve problems and work together. It was good. It did what it said on the packaging, and I enjoyed it, but it didn't like leave an indelible mark on my soul. And I think that's okay. I feel like in the world of social media, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here. In the world of social media, I feel like people feel that if a piece of art, be it a book or a movie or a TV show or something, isn't like the absolute best ever, then it's not worth enjoying. And I don't know, I feel like I need to be better at this sometimes too, because our expectations a lot of times are so high. And so we're like, if this book doesn't change my life in meaningful ways, then it just, you know, it doesn't work. We don't want things to be mid, and sometimes something can just be good, and that's fine. So even though the ending did feel a little easy, I still had a great time with the book, and I would still recommend it to others, but just kind of know what you're getting into. It's more of a thought experiment than it is sort of a messy, convoluted plot that sort of ends in tragedy or destruction or ends in a really open-ended way. It's a very neat and tidy, almost parable about society and human nature and development. Next up is my favorite nonfiction read of March, and I think I only read one nonfiction book, and that was Pandora's Jar by Natalie Haynes, and I loved this book. This book is also responsible for the Greek mythology hyperfixation that I'm currently careening through right now. But it's a nonfiction look at sort of the infamous women of Greek mythology and the way that their stories were sort of told originally, and then how they evolved over the years, because Greek mythology has no like set canon. There is no sort of original correct chronology or sequence of events or anything. It was very oral tradition, and so you had different versions of the stories depending on where you were. The stories interacted. You had some versions of the story taking elements from one and going on to others, and then you've got the transition from sort of the oral tradition going into sort of epic poetry or lyric poetry, and then you've got plays, and then that goes into like new generations, and you've got like the Romans who are taking Greek myths, like Ovid's Metamorphoses, and how he takes some Greek stories and then retells them adding more details and adding more kind of emotional focus on certain things. And so it was really fascinating to see how these characters changed and evolved, and sort of what their characters meant for the story. What was their purpose in the story, and how did pop culture's opinion of them change? There's some characters who, like Medea, who are like, the things that they do are monstrous, but we love this character because she just has this sort of fire and righteous rage. It's sort of reassuring to see someone sort of just lose it and just go bonkers. I don't know. There's good stuff there. And so we've got characters like, you know, the version of Medea that we see in like the 1963 movie Jason and the Argonauts, where she's this sort of a fawning love interest, and she's got kind of a bit of a dangerous vibe, but for the most part she's just there for Jason to kiss at the end after he's saved everyone. Like, she's not much of a character. But then you've got one of the big epic plays, I think it's Euripides, because he wrote women really well, his version of Medea, and she's this character that you can't take your eyes off of her because she's so compelling. Even though she's evil and does awful things, she's still a really great character that you just love to get inside her head. And so it was really interesting to see how Haynes sort of broke everything down. And it's also, this book is funny, this book is so entertaining, and so it isn't just like dry scholarship, even though the scholarship is really well done, and she really does a good job of pointing out all the different sources and how things, like how the stories changed through the years. But I loved this book, would highly recommend it. I got it off Libby, and so if you can get it from your library, read it. It's not a long read, but it's so much fun. It's really, really good. Next up is my favorite fiction standalone for the month of March, and that would have to be Natalie Haynes again, her book, 1,000 Ships. This book was wonderful. I absolutely loved the way that this book works. And it's difficult to kind of explain what the book is, because just saying that it's the events of the Trojan War from the point of view of the female characters really does it a bit of a disservice, because it's very much a mosaic of perspectives, and it's told all out of order chronologically. And so you've got sort of, I think it starts kind of at the end at like the sacking of Troy, and then it goes back and kind of jumps around in time. The only chronological kind of through line is there's a series of letters written by Penelope, who's Odysseus' wife, where she's sort of following his events. Apparently she consulted a bard, or like an oracle type person, who is implied maybe to even be Homer himself. But she's kind of consulting a bard, and he kind of tells the story of what is happening to Odysseus as he goes. So we get the story of the Odyssey from her perspective with like her commentary, and it's so good. But that's sort of the chronological thing. So throughout this, we also get the events of the Odyssey as well, from Penelope's kind of point of view, as she's kind of seeing and commenting on what's happening to her husband as he's away from home for like 20 years. And everything else sort of jumps around. And so you've got all kinds of characters who are sort of footnotes in the original stories. Characters like Andromache, who just had a whole bunch of awful stuff happen to her. Her son was killed to sort of prevent anyone from taking revenge. And I think she's also the wife of Hector, and Hector is killed brutally in the Iliad. And so it just basically kind of just her by herself in the end. There's also a really gorgeous vignette that's Briseis and Chryses. And they just sort of meet in the Achaean camp, and they're just sitting next to each other, and they kind of get to know each other and start talking. This moment is it's just a quiet, still moment, but the characterization and the emotion of it, and it's just gorgeous. I absolutely loved it. Overall, this book just weaves such a complex tapestry, because it's not really about the Trojan War. It's about how female characters, or just women in this time period, are often seen as accessories to sort of the actions of male characters. And then it explores the effects that has on them. And then it also looks at the impact that they had on the whole situation. One of the characters that we get is even like Calliope, who's the muse of epic poetry, whom Homer is is praying to sort of tell his story. And we get her commentary on like the act of poetry itself. So it's very meta, it's so good, but just the way that she constructs this is just masterful. I've read her other book, Stone Blind, which is her Medusa retelling, and while I did like that one and I thought that it was really, really good, it felt a little more fun and playful. Like it's very much making fun of Perseus, and also just showing Medusa as just sort of an everyday person who was having a good, quiet life until he showed up. But this one is telling something very deep and moving and emotional, and it just really, really blew me away. So definitely would recommend this highly. I loved it. I actually went through this in audio form. I got the audiobook off of Libby, and the author herself narrates it, and she does such a good job. But this is definitely one that I'd say if you can like read this while listening to the narration, I definitely suggest that. But it's also just, this is a really, really incredible read. I really loved this one. Next up is books that surprised me. And the one that really, I don't know, I have kind of mixed feelings about is Zora Neale Hurston's Moses, Man of the Mountain. Now, I really enjoyed this one. This is a retelling of the Moses story, but it's told with sort of modern, or like it was written in the 30s, so it's told in like 20th century vernacular. And so the Hebrews all sort of speak like African American people in the 30s, and then there's also sort of the dialect and language of the Egyptians feels very like white Southerners. And the overall feel of this is that it's a story about Moses becoming almost a deity in himself. This is very much not like biblical, because God is a character in here, and he's sort of more like a specific god of this one mountain, and isn't sort of like the all, this isn't really the Hebrew god, so to speak. But Moses is very much a magician who learns magic from Jethro, and then also kind of learns how to manipulate the elements from knowledge he obtains, and then also from the god of the mountain. And so all of the plagues, for example, are things that Moses does himself. It isn't something that like God does through him. And so it's a really compelling take on the story. It's very epic and sweeping, and the emotion of it is really fantastic. This feels really, really modern. But this was also a really interesting look into Zora Neale Hurston's mind. She was kind of a controversial figure. Her work is really good, and it's well regarded in intellectual circles, but when we talk about her book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, or maybe even Jonah's Gourdvine, or her short stories, which are really fantastic. But this book isn't talked about a lot, and I can see why, because she wasn't really well liked among the Black community, especially later on. She sort of died penniless and in obscurity because she was sort of rejected by her community. Her mindset was very much a conservative one, and you see that a lot in this, because a lot of this book is the Israelites having to basically learn how to be free, because they're very dependent on the Egyptians, and they're very sort of set in their ways, and there's this pressure that Moses has to kind of teach them that like freedom is a state of mind, and they have to work past their sort of comfortable existence before and move on. And you can see where there's a problem with that there, because it ignores the fact that racism and subjugation are very much systemic issues. And when you blame sort of the people being subjugated for just not being strong enough, or not having the right mindset to like make themselves be free, because you should just help yourself out because you're not working hard enough, that's kind of dangerous, because it gets into victim blaming and everything. And so I can see why this book isn't talked about a whole lot, because we get a view into how Hurston saw her own people, and she was much more of a type of person that was sort of like, if you just work hard enough, you can get your freedom and you can move beyond subjugation and racism. Whereas in reality, you've got folks like Richard Wright and even poets like Langston Hughes who understood that the deck was stacked against Black people in that time. And so it wasn't just a matter of they just had to change their mindset and just learn how to get along, but they understood how it was systemic issues that needed to be overturned. And so you needed action and you needed actual meaningful change at the government level and society, and you needed to make things more fair so that people could be themselves and live free and live as themselves. And so this book is sort of the one that sort of finally made it click, sort of why Hurston wasn't thought very highly of by her community, and why she sort of ended up sort of dying alone in obscurity. Now, that doesn't mean to say that she's a bad author. I think one thing that we really love about Hurston's writing is that she was so accurate about dialect and culture that even though it made people in the 30s mad because they wanted to portray Black people in a very positive light, show them as respectable, upstanding citizens and not as sort of people who speak in dialect. They wanted sort of more assimilation, and with her writing characters who spoke in kind of dialect that was mocked, that didn't really sit right with them. So she is a good writer, and I do think this was a very fantastic book to read, and I would still recommend it, but it does give us some insight into her sort of more conservative mindset and the way that she viewed the whole situation, and the way that that mindset sort of created conflict between her and other Black writers of the Harlem Renaissance. All right, next up is a book that disappointed me in the month of March, and this one kind of hurts to go about it, but I'm going to try to be fair because I do want to point out that this was sort of my experience, and it may just not have been the right time to read this, but The Archive Undying by Emma Miko Candon. I've been looking forward to reading this for a while, and this was a very difficult read. I ended up sort of DNFing at about 100 pages, and I've gone online and I've seen that a lot of other people really struggled to read this. Now, a lot of people did also really enjoy it, and there's a lot to like about this one. The concept is very cool. The main character is sort of this queer disaster character, and I love him, but the way that she describes things is basically she doesn't describe things. It's all everyone, the main character is very much in his head, and we don't get a good sense of what the world looks like or what the environment around them looks like. And so you've got these giant robots and evil AIs that are taking over things, and the main character is sort of missing memories, and he's in kind of conflict with himself. There's aspects of his own memory that he's repressing that he doesn't even have access to. And so I understand why you'd have sort of a character who is confused and who doesn't understand where they are or what they're doing or what's really going on. That's fine. And there's even some playing around with like second person, and there's like different second persons, so you're not really sure, like there's different voices that are in second person, so it's not all the same person. So you kind of have to really pay attention to sort of which second person perspective is being used. And that was difficult, but the thing that really got me is that there's no or very little description of sort of what everything looks like. And so you've got, you know, descriptions of sort of these vast robots that are kind of roaming the landscape, and you get sort of descriptions of pieces of them and fragments. And I know that that's meant to sort of create disorientation in the reader, and because the main character is sort of feeling confused himself, but all of the conversations between other characters, it just felt like it was all taking place in like a featureless white room. There was no sense of place. And so I'm okay with the unreliable narrator, and I'm okay with the not really sure what's going on part of what the character's experiencing. But the way you balance that out is you have really strong sensory details of what the place around them looks like in the world, so that you can at least have a sense of, okay, I don't know where this character is, and we're going to obviously learn about what's going on with him later, and that's fine, but you then have a sense of where they are, what's going on, what their like short-term goals are. And in this, I had no clue what the goals were, what anyone wanted. It was just sort of people talking, and there was a bit of a through line with the main character, who was having sort of a relationship with this doctor who's with him, and it was sort of a self-destructive sort of relationship, but there was nothing to grab onto. There was no short-term things that I could look forward to, and there was nothing to sort of mitigate the confusion. And so the language was so gorgeous and detailed, but I just felt so lost that keeping, like, it's like you had to keep the details of everything you possibly could in your head, because the book gave you very little. And so there would be like one sentence 20 pages ago, and you had to remember that one tiny detail for anything in the present to make sense. And it was so hard to follow the plot, and I ended up having to DNF it. A book that this sort of reminded me of was N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy, because that book also plays with POV, and there's sort of this sense of confusion, and the main character doesn't really know everything, and there's things that the character, or that the audience doesn't know about the world, that the character slowly comes to understand. But it worked, because the sensory details of the world, and also the short-term goals of like, okay, I don't know where I'm going, but I do know I need this at least. And so we can focus on the short-term goal. And so even though it was very confusing at first, you felt grounded enough that you could follow the plot. And with this one, I never felt grounded at all. And I felt like the author was being a little cheeky and keeping a lot of things from the reader, which is fine, but then was also keeping like really important stuff from the reader as well, in terms of just what the world looked like and what the environment was like and what things were. And so you're just sort of left wandering around, not able to follow anything. So I don't know, it was kind of disappointing, because I do like this author, and I do remember that their Star Wars novel, Ronin, had a similar kind of ethereal quality, where it's a very different world. It's a Star Wars novel, but it's like an alternate universe in the Star Wars universe. And so I remember that one is also, I bounced off of it at first, but once you got into it, it made sense. But there was more sensory details in that, and so there were short-term goals. And so even though the world as a whole, you didn't really get a sense of what that was right away, over time you learned information, and as you learned information, your sense of what things looked like and what the world was like kind of coalesced. And in this one, it was sort of like, I'm keeping information from you, but I'm also going to keep everything from you. So it's like you were watching a movie where like half the screen was grayed out, and there was like patches missing, and so you had to kind of make sense of what was going on by just hearing the dialogue and not really knowing where they were or what was really happening. And you get flashes of things here and there, but it was so oblique that it wasn't fun to read. It wasn't enjoyable, even though everything about this concept should have been incredible, because you've got this like disaster of a main character who just, you know, is sort of sarcastic and cynical, and he's in this world inhabited by giant robots and evil AIs, and everything about that should have worked. But when you have a story like that and you can't see anything, it's really hard to follow, and I just didn't have the patience to stick with it. I've read reviews by a lot of other people who said that they struggled to understand what was going on, and even when they got to the end, they said it just sort of left them more confused. So that sort of justified my DNFing this. But I don't know, I'm gonna keep it around. I might give it another go in the future, but for a first time go, I really bounced hard off of this. If anyone else has read this and liked it, I'm curious sort of what the trick is to understanding this, because I really felt like I was missing a lot of information on how to to read it. There's even a thing at the beginning that has sort of like a list of characters that you'll meet, and there's entire things where it's like classified, redacted, and it was like, well, why would you have a list of characters if only to say, haha, I can't tell you the names of most of these characters, you'll have to figure it out. Like, it felt a little too in love with how obscure everything was, and it just didn't really work for me. So I don't know, I'm gonna keep a hold of this, and I might read it in the future, but for a first time read, it really didn't work for me. So now I'm looking forward to next month and what's going to go on. So I'm deep in my mythology hyperfixation right now. So I'm going to be finishing up the Iliad. I'm reading the Iliad right now, and then I'm going to read the Odyssey and the Aeneid and the Metamorphoses. That will be like multiple months because it'll take me a little bit longer to get through all those. But in terms of everything else, at this point I'm just kind of at the mercy of whatever Libby throws at me, says, oh, your hold's available. So I'm like, well, I guess I'm reading that now. But I don't know, I'm kind of really enjoying that. I do want to read Claire North's Songs of Penelope trilogy. I want to read this kind of when I get to the Odyssey, so I might read this sort of in between the Iliad and the Odyssey. We'll see how that works. It takes me longer to get through physical books than it does audiobooks because I have a lot more time to listen to audiobooks, and so I get through them really, really fast. So in terms of that, I'm going to hope to continue with my Jane Austen marathon. I've got 3 Jane Austen books left, and so I probably can get through those. I'm going through those in audio, so I could probably get through those in April. So we'll see how it all goes, but for the most part, I'm looking forward to April, and I'm curious what you've been reading. So what has been a book that you loved, hated? Tell me about it in the comments. And with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.